Inflation directly impacts your purchasing power, making it one of the most noticeable effects on personal finances. Let's explore what this means and how it affects your day-to-day life. As inflation rises, the cost of goods and services increases. This means that over time, the same amount of money buys fewer items. For example, $100 that used to cover a week's groceries might only stretch for a few days during high inflation. The loss of purchasing power is especially challenging for people with fixed incomes, like retirees. Without adjustments to income, inflation can significantly erode their ability to maintain their standard of living. Inflation also affects long-term financial planning. The money saved for future goals, like buying a home or funding education, may lose its value if it isn't invested wisely. A dollar saved today will be worth less tomorrow if inflation isn't accounted for. Understanding purchasing power helps us make informed decisions about spending, saving, and investing. In the next part, we'll discuss how inflation increases the overall cost of living and what that means for your finances. Stay tuned for more insights into the complex ways inflation shapes our economic reality. Inflation has a direct impact on the cost of living, making everyday essentials more expensive over time. Let's explore how this affects households and personal finances. As inflation rises, the prices of goods and services like housing, food, healthcare, and transportation increase. This puts more strain on household budgets, especially for families with fixed or limited incomes. Rent and mortgage payments are often the first to rise. Inflation pushes up property values and construction costs, which in turn increases the cost of housing. For renters, landlords may pass on these rising costs in the form of higher rents. Utilities like electricity, gas, and water also become more expensive during periods of inflation. Energy prices, in particular, can fluctuate dramatically due to economic and geopolitical factors. Food costs are another area where inflation hits hard. From groceries to dining out, rising costs for raw materials, transportation, and labor drive up prices, forcing households to adjust their spending habits. Transportation costs, including fuel and public transit fares, also climb with inflation. This can make commuting and travel more expensive, reducing disposable income for other needs. Understanding how inflation increases the cost of living highlights the importance of budgeting and financial planning. In the next part, we'll discuss how inflation erodes savings and what you can do to protect your financial future. Stay tuned for more insights into how inflation impacts your finances. Inflation doesn't just impact spending, it also quietly erodes the value of your savings over time. Let's explore how this happens and what you can do to protect your financial future. When inflation rises, the purchasing power of money decreases. This means that money sitting in a traditional savings account loses value if the interest earned doesn't outpace inflation. For example, if inflation is 5% and your savings account earns 2% interest, your money's real value shrinks by 3% annually. This erosion of value can have significant long-term effects, especially on retirement savings or funds earmarked for future goals like buying a home or paying for education. Over decades, even moderate inflation can drastically reduce the purchasing power of saved money. Inflation also affects emergency funds. While it's essential to keep cash for unexpected expenses, holding too much in low-interest accounts exposes your savings to devaluation. To combat this, consider investing in assets that have the potential to outpace inflation. Stocks, real estate, and inflation-protected securities like Treasury inflation-protected securities, TIPS, can help preserve and grow your wealth. Understanding how inflation erodes savings highlights the importance of proactive financial planning. In the next part, we'll explore how inflation influences investment decisions and the strategies you can use to navigate a rising cost environment. Stay tuned for more insights into the far-reaching effects of inflation on personal and global finances. Inflation doesn't just affect spending and savings, it also plays a significant role in shaping investment decisions. Let's explore how inflation influences where and how people invest. When inflation rises, it erodes the real returns of investments. For example, if a bond yields 3% annually but inflation is at 4%, the investor's purchasing power decreases despite earning interest. Stocks are often considered a good hedge against inflation. Companies can increase prices to keep pace with inflation, potentially leading to higher revenues and stock prices. However, not all sectors perform equally well. Consumer staples and energy often thrive, while sectors like technology may face challenges. Real estate is another popular inflation-resistant investment. Property values and rental income tend to rise with inflation, providing a stable return in uncertain times. Commodities like gold and silver are traditional inflation hedges. Their value often increases as the purchasing power of currency decreases, making them a safe harbor during economic turbulence. Inflation-protected securities, such as Treasury inflation-protected securities, TIPS, are designed specifically to counter inflation. These investments adjust their value based on inflation rates, helping protect purchasing power. Diversification becomes crucial during periods of inflation. Spreading investments across different asset classes can reduce risks and stabilize returns. Understanding how inflation impacts investments helps investors make informed decisions and protect their portfolios. In the next part, we'll explore the impact of inflation on wages and earnings. Stay tuned for more insights into the multifaceted effects of inflation on personal and global finances. Inflation not only affects prices and savings, but also has a significant impact on wages and earnings. Let's dive into how rising inflation influences income and what it means for workers and businesses. In an ideal scenario, wages should increase at the same rate as inflation. However, this isn't always the case. When wages fail to keep up with rising prices, workers experience a decline in real income, meaning their purchasing power decreases even if their nominal salary remains the same. Certain sectors may see quicker wage adjustments. For example, industries facing labor shortages or high demand for skilled workers might raise salaries to attract talent. Meanwhile, jobs in more stable or oversupplied sectors may see slower wage growth. Inflation can also lead to wage price spirals. As workers demand higher pay to keep up with rising costs, businesses may raise prices to cover increased labor costs, creating a feedback loop that perpetuates inflation. For businesses, managing wages during inflation is a balancing act. Raising salaries helps retain talent but can squeeze profit margins. Many companies turn to efficiency measures, automation, or selective hiring to mitigate these challenges. Employees can protect their earnings by seeking cost of living adjustments or exploring roles in industries with higher wage growth potential. Upskilling or transitioning to in-demand fields can also help workers stay ahead of inflationary pressures. Understanding how inflation impacts wages and earnings is crucial for navigating today's economy. In the next part, we'll discuss how inflation drives borrowing costs and what it means for loans and mortgages. Stay tuned for more insights into the complex effects of inflation on personal and global finances. Inflation doesn't just affect spending and earnings, it also impacts borrowing costs. Let's explore how rising inflation influences loans, mortgages, and other forms of debt. As inflation increases, central banks often raise interest rates to control it. This leads to higher borrowing costs for individuals and businesses. For example, a mortgage with a low fixed rate may no longer be available, and variable rate loans become more expensive over time. Higher interest rates mean higher monthly payments on loans, which can strain household budgets. This is particularly challenging for those with significant debt, such as mortgages, car loans, or student loans. For businesses, increased borrowing costs can limit expansion and investment opportunities. Companies may postpone projects or reduce hiring to manage higher loan repayments, which can slow economic growth. On the flip side, inflation can benefit borrowers with fixed-rate loans. As the value of money decreases over time, the real cost of repaying debt becomes lower, effectively reducing the burden of long-term loans. Credit card users need to be especially cautious during inflationary periods. High-interest credit card debt can quickly spiral out of control when rates rise, leading to significant financial stress. Understanding the impact of inflation on borrowing highlights the importance of managing debt wisely and exploring fixed-rate loan options when possible. In the next part, we'll discuss how inflation benefits debtors and why it's not all bad news for those with loans. Stay tuned for more insights into the far-reaching effects of inflation on personal and global finances. Inflation isn't all bad news, especially for those with certain types of debt. Let's explore how inflation can benefit debtors and reduce the burden of long-term loans. When inflation rises, the real value of money decreases over time. For borrowers with fixed-rate loans, this means they're repaying their debts with money that's worth less than when they initially borrowed it. This effectively lowers the real cost of the loan. For example, imagine you take out a $100,000 fixed-rate mortgage. If inflation rises significantly, the $1,000 monthly payment remains the same in nominal terms, but it becomes easier to afford as wages and prices increase. Businesses also benefit from this dynamic. Companies with fixed-rate loans can invest in growth while inflation diminishes the real value of their debt, boosting profitability over time. However, this benefit doesn't apply to all debt. Variable-rate loans and credit card balances can become more expensive as interest rates rise alongside inflation, negating any potential advantage. It's also essential to manage debt carefully. Even though inflation can reduce its real cost, excessive borrowing carries risks, especially during volatile economic times. Understanding how inflation impacts debt allows individuals and businesses to make smarter financial decisions. In the next part, we'll discuss how inflation influences economic policies and how governments and central banks respond to rising prices. Stay tuned for the conclusion of our series on inflation's effects on personal and global finances. Inflation doesn't just affect individuals and businesses, it plays a critical role in shaping economic policies. Let's explore how governments and central banks respond to inflation and why their actions matter. Central banks, like the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank, use monetary policy to manage inflation. One of their primary tools is adjusting interest rates. By raising rates, they make borrowing more expensive, reducing demand and slowing inflation. Conversely, lowering rates stimulates economic activity during low inflation periods. Governments also use fiscal policy to combat inflation. Strategies like reducing public spending or increasing taxes can help cool an overheated economy. These measures aim to balance supply and demand and stabilize prices. Inflation targeting is another common approach. Many central banks aim to keep inflation within a specific range, usually around 2%. This provides businesses and consumers with a stable economic environment for planning and investing. High inflation often forces policymakers to make tough decisions. For example, raising interest rates can curb inflation but may also slow economic growth and increase unemployment. In developing countries, managing inflation can be particularly challenging. Factors like currency instability, reliance on imports, and weaker institutions can make it harder to implement effective policies. For individuals, understanding economic policies and their goals helps in making informed financial decisions. Being aware of policy changes can help you anticipate shifts in interest rates, inflation, and overall economic conditions. This concludes our series on the top 8 ways inflation impacts your finances. By understanding these effects, you're better equipped to navigate the complexities of today's economic landscape. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Here's to making smarter financial decisions in an ever-changing world.